In this episode, we continue making dioramas for the forest world, and if you want to see all the worlds and the builds from those worlds from the beginning, there's a link down below. This video focuses on the pond. It's the first diorama with water that we made, and the first time I used any of these crafting techniques, period. I'd have to learn how to do terrain, grass, painting, and resin. And fortune favors the bold, so let's get into it.
A year prior, we brainstormed having a quest in a magical pond. We wanted to learn to craft with water, and we wanted something happening at the bottom of this pond. We had some ideas like a magical fish or a treasure chest. We created a cardboard version of the forest world, and we used a tiny piece of aluminum foil to represent water. But creating the real pond would definitely not be as easy, and I'm foreshadowing here.
We took our paper templates and used them to size up the pieces of foam that we would cut. This way we could be sure everything would fit on the table. We used our utility knives to cut our XPS foam bases into smaller, more manageable pieces so that we could use a wire cutter to cut them later. We cut all of our pieces for this world at the same time using our hot wire foam cutter. I used the hot wand attachment to carve out the basin of the pond. It didn't really work particularly well, and if anyone knows a better technique, please let me know. And I will say that it did help keep the shape I wanted for the pond. I dug out the middle with a utility knife and pliers, and it gave it a rough bottom. I mixed up some plaster of Paris to coat the bottom. I was planning to pour some easy water for the water effect and wanted to make sure that the bottom was sealed and the foam wouldn't melt. I coated the bottom with the mixture and then I let it dry for about an hour. It takes about 30 minutes for it to dry and then maybe 3 hours to even a day to fully cure, but I started painting right away. I took some dollar store paint, brushes, plastic painting palettes, and paint cups to hold water, and I got to work on painting the pond bed. At first I mixed up some black, blue, and gray. I wanted to give the pond a realistic and slightly rocky bottom, and I added the blue in thinking it might give some blue reflections and help the effect of water. Then I white brushed the whole thing to bring out the highlights and the texture of the rocks. And I didn't just use white, I also used some blue and some green. And in the end, I really didn't like the result, so I painted the whole thing black. I wanted to give the pond bed the feel of an uncared-for aquarium. And for this, I used Woodland Scenic spray tack glue and a bunch of their flocking and ballast, fine green flocking, and some sticks that would serve as logs that I could put and decorate at the bottom. I sprayed down the whole basin with the spray tack glue, and I sprinkled on a little bit of flocking. And then I put a few tufts of 12mm grass to serve as swamp grass. Then I carefully positioned twigs and rocks and logs in places that I thought looked pleasing. And when I was satisfied with the look, I sprayed it down again with the spray tack glue, and then added a bit more flocking. We planned to put a gem at the bottom of the pond that would light up when the quest was completed. We used some blue dye in the water to see which color of the gem would be the best through the watercolor. We chose green and placed it in the crevice of the pond base to simulate an asteroidal impact. Once the pond bed was all figured out, I used Sculptamold to create a similar terrain effect as the other bases we made for the mushroom area and the forest path. I just caked that on and then flattened it out with my hands. I wore nitrile gloves just for keeping my hands clean, but I'm not sure that Sculptamold is actually harmful to the skin or anything. I just wore the gloves anyway. I used some brown paint with aquarium sand to add texture, then added spotty layers of red, yellow, and green to give it a realistic clay mud look. Once the paint had dried, I pulled out the static grass applicator and some Woodland Scenic grass. I decided to go with a base layer of 2mm green grass and then a top layer of longer straw-colored grass. I laid down a good amount of Mod Podge over the top of the diorama, and I used a cut-out piece of cardboard to protect the inside of the pond. Then I applied the short base layer of grass. I used a short length of wire as the ground for this static grass as I found it was a bit more mobile than the clawfoot the machine comes with, and it worked a bit better. And you know, I found that static grass tends to stick up straight, but eventually lays back down over time. Can anyone let me know if they've found a solution for this? I wanted to create an old, rotten dock that stretched out into the pond. For this, I used X-Acto knives, coffee sticks, and a steel brush. I cut the sticks into some broken plank shapes, then brushed them with the steel brush to give them texture. Then I took some green and brown paint and I diluted them with water to create a kind of stain, and I stained the planks. Then I brushed on a layer of darker brown paint to fill in the empty spots. I also added a few dabs of glue and moss flocking to help make the dock look really aged. I think it came out pretty well for my very first try making a wooden structure. Now our adventurers had a diving board to go in and get those gems. Okay, now it was time to get both nervous and excited. It was time to make water for the very first time. So from watching tutorials, Woodland Scenic's Easy Water seemed like the simplest choice for newbies, as resin seemed a little bit too daunting for us. Look, you take a bag of small pellets, we added a tiny bit of royal blue dye powder to give it a tinge of color, and melt them down on low heat on the stove. So we got a small cast iron pot for this, as not to destroy any important cookware. We used a wooden stir stick to move the pellets around and help melt everything. The blue dye didn't seem to even show up, so we added a little bit more, which might have been a mistake. Of course, the cast iron pot was so black it was pretty hard to tell what the final color would be. Once all the pellets were melted, it was time to pour. And almost immediately we realized that easy water is for extremely shallow pours because the water was basically black. This completely ruined all the work I did on the bottom of the pond and obscured the gem completely, and the diorama was pretty much no longer usable. After pouring, the sides all bubbled up, and we tried adding flocking to the edges, which was minimally helpful. I tried adding more flocking around the edges, and that made the pond look absolutely tiny. I added some dirt for the path, and used the heat gun to melt down the center so that the gem could be added to the top of the pond instead of inside. And this was okay, but it was really far from the concept that we were aiming for originally, and honestly it was really frustrating. Now, since the pond looked like something out of an educational video about childbirth, we decided to start again and do it right. We cut out some far bigger pieces based on a new design, and this would give us a lot more space for the players to put their characters on the diorama. Now, doing the first pond and the mushroom piece showed us that we needed a lot bigger bases to make the game playable, so we supersized all of our bases from then on. For the new pond, I wanted a nice, deep pool. And I used the hot wand for the initial cuts because, as of the making of this video, we still don't have a scooping tool. And at some point we're really going to have to get one because the tools for foam sculpting are super important and they really shape the final result. Like as you can see here, the only option I really have is to create a rough bottom. And that's okay because it gives a natural look, but it did make painting more difficult down the road. As with all of our bases, I mixed up some Sculptamold and covered the top. We did a batch for all the bases in the forest world, and you can check out how these builds were made in the previous episode. It was definitely the easiest way to get a nice ground terrain look and mask the foam.
We brought back our whiteboard and notebook to try to figure out the story of the pond and decide what would happen at the bottom of it to make it more interesting. We traced the shape of each diorama on the board, and then we discussed the story, the dynamic of each quest, and how the pond would fit into all of this. We reviewed the layout and decided to add another layer to make the pond even bigger so that we can make it deeper.
We pulled out some more XPS foam and traced out a wider base. As usual, we went outside to cut it. I decided to bevel the edges with the hot wire cutter to give it the look of sandstone cliffs, and I liked it, so I did this around the entire outside edge. I cut the bottom out of the pond with the hot wand, and at this point it was looking dangerously close to a toilet seat, but I continued on. I then traced out the shape onto the new base using a pencil, and I decided to try something different. I used the heat gun to melt the XPS foam to make a pattern for the pond floor. It ended up looking a little bit like veins, which I guess is pretty cool. I mixed up another batch of Sculptamold to stick the two pieces together and hide the joint. I used the same painting technique as the other bases, but I think I forgot the sand on this one, so it ended up looking like a big overflowing toilet. Using the plaster of Paris technique, we made some rocks, and I glued two to the top of the diorama. I painted the rocks and added some texture to it, so then it looked like a rocky, gritty, overflowing toilet. Much better. I worked on adding earth tone colors to make the dirt seem more realistic. I started with a lighter brown, then added some darker brown stripes. When that only enhanced the toilet motif, I broke out the red, yellow, and green. I painted this mostly by instinct, as I'm a novice painter and I didn't really know exactly what to do. And once I had this weird stripe pattern, I used some darker brown to blend everything together, and I white brushed it for good measure. No idea why I did it this way, there's probably a better technique, but that's what I did. The concept of this pond was that it was a rift in space and time where a merman and a kraken would battle for eternity, which means we would need some lighting. So we used a drill to make holes that we would need to run wires.
Once again, we used our pre-wired 12-volt LEDs and a 9-volt battery to test the lights. But don't connect a regular LED to a 9-volt battery without the proper resistor or it will explode.
Once the holes were drilled, we ran an LED into the base and tested how it would look running through a gem. I also cut some pieces to try to hide the light that was meant to light up the pond, but none of these pieces really looked right. I stuck down some pieces of foam as stands for the mini characters and started painting the bottom. I decided to try and paint a maelstrom pattern. Although I have no art or painting background, I thought maybe I could do it. I used a black base and painted various blues and aqua colors on the bottom in a swirling maelstrom pattern. And it was painstaking work because I'd never done it before. But when I tried placing the characters in it, that's when I knew that I would probably have to paint some more. I tried adding the light to it while I was painting, just to see if I could make sure that this thing would look good, but it really didn't come out right. I just ended up not liking it. And actually on video, it looks kind of good, so I'm not sure exactly what I didn't like, but I didn't like it, and sometimes experiments, they just don't work out. And at that point, you gotta move on. Try something else. So once again, I decided to start over and paint the whole base black again. Now this time, I went for a floating in space concept. I used a paintbrush to speckle little white stars onto the black background, so that it would be like the kraken and the merman were stuck in the void of space and just floating and battling together forever. I tested the paint job with a light, and I put the minis in it, and it was alright. It looks pretty good here on video, but I still just didn't like it for some reason. So I decided to start over again. So I painted the bottom of the pond black again. I decided on a simple blue gradient, something that was lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. Now I was really hoping that this version would look a lot more like natural water, because every single time I tried to paint something stylized, it just looked cartoony and I ended up scrapping the entire thing. But I think I caught a break when I decided to take advantage of the vein pattern at the bottom of the pond and painted it red. Now, I tried a few different shades, the yellows, oranges, even fluorescent orange, and that didn't really work, so I ended up sticking with red, and I think that looked pretty cool. After that, I used some lighter blue colors to highlight the pond floor, sort of like the way some above-ground pools have a blue pattern on their liner. I thought it would simulate some light hitting the bottom of the pond. I think it looked okay. The next step was to paint the kraken and the merman and place them into the pond. But yet again, I struggled to find a color scheme that worked. Just nothing was happening right for me on this build. But as it turned out, we were both struggling with our builds, so we made a choice. To give up.
It was not coming together, and you will see that in the next episode. So, we decided to swap tasks. I pulled out the white primer paint and took the miniatures to the basement to reprime them after stripping off the paint. It was nice to use our model paint again. We used AK Interactive as the base colors, but we often mix in some Citadel contrast and layer paint. It had been a good 9 months since the last time I did mini painting. I needed to refresh myself on the tools and techniques like our brushes and the super helpful clamped magnifier for small details and lighting up our work. Most of all, I had to remember how to use the wet palette. I found images of sea creatures like this cool octopus as an inspiration for the kraken. And based on that color scheme, I put drops of paint on the wet palette and went for it. I love painting minis, so getting back into it was super nice. The color scheme I had selected was working, which was good after all the challenges we had faced with this diorama so far. I gave the teeth a nice bright white coat and then went on with the best part of all, dry brushing. All in all, I was really happy with the look. I went on to paint the merman, and the natural color scheme that came to mind was blue. The paint job worked out fine, but we both knew that it would be problematic. But we'll talk about that later. Once they were painted, I placed them in the pond where they would be locked into an infinite battle.
I used the hot glue gun on low heat to set in the kraken first. and then the merman. I tried to put them in a pose that looked like they were battling each other. Next, I glued the polymer clay light over one of the LED holes. I was hoping this would look like a crystal structure of some sort and diffuse some of the light so that the characters would look good when the light came on. And finally, I glued a red gem over the last LED hole. Whew, it was a long road to this point, but it was finally time to add water. Well, resin, but look, you get the idea. I traced out the shape of the pond on a piece of paper, and I cut it out to use as a guide for cutting a piece of transparent acrylic. Now we got some heavy metal C-clamps to hold the acrylic down while cutting. We'd also purchased a saw that's supposed to be good at cutting things like plexiglass. I'm not sure that it was, but that's what it was supposed to be for. So I traced the shape onto an acrylic sheet with a Sharpie, and I started cutting. And sure enough, I found out that the saw was terrible, and without a proper tool, I would have to change my plan. So I put a new blade into my utility knife and I went to work. I scored the acrylic until I could crack it along the line, like cutting ceramic tiles if you've ever done that. I also realized that I did not need a circle. I cut out a square and I chopped off the corners. You know, I was going to cover the edges anyway, so any shape would work as long as it was big enough to cover the hole in the pond.
The idea of the acrylic sheet was to use it as the base for the epoxy resin pour. We used a few egg crates to cut strip in order to make a lip all around the plexiglass. I had to cut enough of them to go all around. And I used green painter's tape to set them in place. It was a really weird contraption and we didn't know if it would work at all. I tried avoiding any leak with a bead of hot glue.
We decided to use magic resin because it seemed like the easiest for beginners. It came with a few various colors of mica powder. Now, I didn't know what mica powder was, so it would be a surprise when I would use it later. We watched some resin pouring tutorials and got going. We poured equal parts of the 2-part resin into separate containers and mixed the two together. We stirred at the recommended speed for the recommended time, and we also added a tiny bit of mica powder in, and we got to see how it actually worked. Now, it doesn't dissolve, and it comes out more like glitter, so we really didn't put much in because it was a little bit confusing to us.
We saw online that to remove a large number of bubbles, you can place the container in hot water. We boiled some water, then we let it cool down for a few minutes, and then placed the cup in it for about 20 minutes. The resin has a working time of about 30 minutes.
Once the resin was ready, we poured it. It was only a few millimeters thick, as was the plan, and it was really clear. Too clear, actually. There was no visible mica powder in it, and it just looked like a glass window. So we decided to start over, and made another batch to pour on top of the first once it had dried. And we followed the same process as before, but this time we added a lot more mica powder. Now, something to know about mica powder is that the spread out layer of resin is far less opaque than the deep cup. Sort of like the way the ocean is dark blue but clear when you take a small amount of it. So we poured the second layer, and victory! We'd succeeded in screwing the whole thing up. It was way too opaque, and it was hard to tell what was inside. And not to mention, the merman was painted blue, so everything else was also painted blue, and he vanished completely into the background. It was really just back to the drawing board for all of it.
We pulled out the merman, and I repainted him using a warm yellow and orange color scheme to make him stand out. Something I should have done from the beginning.
We cut a new acrylic sheet, which was easier now that we'd done it before. Yay.
We repeated the same process with the egg crates, the painter's tape, and the hot glue.
So now we were under the gun because we only had enough resin for one more try. We took into account everything that we'd learned, and we tried one final time. Okay, so you know the drill. We mixed the resin, we added the mica powder, and this time we aimed for the middle ground between the first two pours. And then we let it sit in hot water to remove the bubbles, which is really satisfying to watch in a time lapse. Then we poured it onto our brand new acrylic piece and crossed our fingers. Once it had cured, we pulled off some of the tape from the frame and tested it over the pond. Finally, it looked like we had it. And even if we didn't, there was no more resin, so this was going to have to be it. I mixed up a big batch of Sculptamold to cover the edges of the acrylic sheet and blended it into the terrain of the base. I had made the acrylic sheet much bigger so that I'd have plenty of space to mold out the shoreline of the pond. I covered all of the edges and spread the Sculptamold down over the hill. This was a very difficult piece for a beginner, and I had really only crafted rocks and painted a few minis by this point, so it was a process of trial and error. And sometimes it was quite frustrating, but I had a vision of an underwater diorama that lit up as the players progressed through the game, and sometimes to get something to look and work the way that you want, you just gotta take several stabs at it. I repainted the top of the pond using good old brown. Finally, the overflowing toilet had returned. I also used a piece of paper to protect the resin from getting brown paint on it. And the last thing I needed was to have to pour another resin layer. Finally, I painted the edges very, very carefully with a slightly darker brown to simulate water-soaked dirt. I think it was coming out pretty great. Once the paint had dried, I decided to try to negate the toilet seat look a little bit by adding grass with Mod Podge and the grass applicator. I layered the grass on top of both the bottom and the top levels of the base, and eventually I decided to cover the entire majority of the diorama with grass. And to give some variety, I added some AK shrubs to one of the corners, and I also took some straw grass and made a shrub for the top level. I felt that adding shrubs and grass broke up the uniform look of just having grass everywhere. I used one of the tree making methods we'd used for the forest path and the mushroom dioramas, and there's a link to those videos if you missed that part of the build. But the basics are, I glued reindeer moss to a short stick with hot glue until it looked something like a tree. I only made one tree, as the focus of this piece was the pond, and I just wanted to break up the shape and not distract from the main point. I took the tree outside and sprayed it with glue until it was tacky enough to add some flocking. I cleared an area of grass so that I could stick down the tree. I planted the tree with a pin in the bottom, then added extra stability with Sculptamold. I shaped the mold into something approximating roots. The final touch was adding some tufts of wildflowers with gamer's grass. I also sprinkled on colorful flocking and some mini leaves to complete the picture. The leaves are actually small seeds that look just like leaves, and it really adds to the realism. They came in green, yellow, and red, so I sprinkled some of each, but mostly used the red and yellow to contrast the green grass. This really felt good to see an old toilet seat turn into a fertile pond with trees and bushes. And as a finishing touch, I used Woodland Scenic's flower flocking inside a spice shaker to make the field of grass look like a blooming meadow. Now, it is hard to believe that after multiple failures and restarts, repaints, and just doing this whole thing 8 million times, this diorama was finally done. Thank you so much to our Patreon and Fourth Wall supporters for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome. So hey, why don't we take a look at the final result and a sneak peek of the next episode. Thanks for checking out this build. Now this is a big series, so there's going to be a lot more videos coming. Feel free to like and subscribe to support the channel.